Greetings, folks. My name is Jess Haynes, and I am a doctoral student at Aspen University. The following presentation is entitled Human and Animal Research Participants. It is a brief look at some of the ethical and practical elements that go into designing a research project if you're going to use living participants. The focus of this project in particular focuses on human participants, but a lot of the elements and a lot of the pieces could be pertinent in regards to animal participants as well. And just in case you guys needed something cute to see in your day, here is my shepherd talking about animal research participants. She apparently thinks she wants me to throw this toy for her, and so she is being very helpful in this whole, doing school during quarantine process. Alright, so we're going to start with the slide presentation. The slide presentation is also attached to this assignment, so you can feel free to follow along. Alright, the first thing I want to talk with you guys about today is the institutional approval of human subjects. What this often boils down to is an IRB, or an Institutional Review Board assessment, and this is something that is required for researchers to complete anytime they're going to be doing a project that involves living participants, and so in this case human participants. The things that the IRB is looking for is the level of risk and the possibility of harm. So the level of requirements, the level of review that the board will set for the different projects will depend upon those things. They're often looking for things along the lines of, is the activity, is the research project going to cause a higher possibility of harm than a normal exam or a normal test that the participants would experience in, say, a mental health setting or a doctor's office, something along those lines. If the answer is yes, then there's probably going to be some form of restrictions that need to occur, some form of other more complicated pieces that are going to need to be in place, which the board will inform the see my cohort here, my co-teacher wants to talk also. Yeah, but there will be other restrictions or perhaps other elements that the IRB wants to bring to the attention of the researcher if there is a higher likelihood of harm. Another important element when you are beginning to consider a research project, when you're looking at gaining approval for it, debating about the pieces of it, what it's going to look like, is called pilot studies. And what pilot studies are is they're small scale preliminary studies that are used to determine the likelihood of what will be needed for the larger research-based study. This can be used to determine what other resources you're going to need. It can be used to help you decide on what your sample size is. It can help you determine a lot of different elements in your major study. And it's just a scaled down version. So instead of the full-on study, which is expensive, it takes a lot of time, a lot of resources go into it, this is the minute version that helps kind of create it's like a scale, basically. Like we do a miniature version of a city, we set it out, so that way we know when we're actually building the real city, is this going to work? Do these things fall in place? Do the pieces fit in the way that we planned on them fitting? And it helps work out the kinks, work out the problems before you lose a lot of money, a lot of time, or have a lot of inaccurate data if something goes down in a way that you didn't intend for it to. One of the most important elements when you're looking at using humans in research as participants is consent. And not just any old consent, not just consent along the lines of like, oh sure, yes, that's fine. But consent that is informed and consent that is complete. So what these things mean as far as informed is that the client understands, or the participant understands, the possible risks that are involved, the possible downsides that are involved, what the possible outcome or implications for them could be. Oftentimes when we're talking about consent, we'll hear these four terms, which is disclosure, comprehension, voluntariness, and competence. And what these mean are disclosure is what we tell the client. Are we hiding something from them, or are we disclosing to them what it is that the possible effects, as we mentioned earlier, could be to them? The comprehension part is, are we presenting it in such a way that they can comprehend? Are we using words that they understand? Are we using terms that they understand? Are we presenting it into a way that, to them in a way that they, where it could be assumed or logical that they can understand it? The next part is voluntariness. And what this touches on is, are they capable of making decisions, or do they feel forced by something somewhere? And with different groups, this becomes more of an issue. Say if somebody's incarcerated, if somebody's underage, if somebody's really desperate for finances, and there's a reimbursement that goes along with one of these studies, that could affect the voluntariness. And so that would be something to consider when we're looking at consent. The other piece is competence. And this one really depends on what you're studying. What the level of competence of baseline is for the population that you're studying. But competence is the person capable of understanding the information, understanding what it means to be voluntary, and is still choosing to participate. If the person has had extreme brain injury, if they've been born with a birth defect that affects their cognitive functioning, perhaps there's not an ability for them to competently consent, and in that case perhaps a caregiver needs to consent. And if the caregiver's consenting, then we need to go back to the fact of, does the caregiver actually have the well-being of the client or of the participant in mind, and if the client did understand, would they respond voluntarily? So those are some of the pieces. It can get fairly complicated, but it is absolutely key. Consent is absolutely key for healthy and ethical research. The next thing we need to consider when we're designing a research project is the methods of data collection. And what this is basically the nuts and bolts of how are we going to gain the information that we need. We've made a thesis statement, we've made a dissertation statement, and now we want to know, so we know what we want to know. The next question is, how are we going to gain that information? The first things we're going to be looking at is, do we need quantitative data for our research project, or do we need qualitative data for our research project? And this will be a good starting point, because then we can branch off from there to decide what actually makes the most sense. And once we know what we need to accomplish in our study, like what type of data do we actually need, then it's a lot easier to determine how we're going to go about getting it. Trying to determine what type of data how you want to collect the data before you've determined what type of data you need can cost you a lot more time and cause a lot more backtracking. So the next thing we're going to look at is sample selection and consent in regards to the elements of deception that sometimes can be necessary, potentially, when it comes to research. When we're looking at sample selection, there's several things that we want to consider here. So sample selection is the people that we're using in our study. There can be sample selection that is random, like you just randomly choose folks, or usually it's more intentional than random. There's definitely some benefits toward it, with it being random, but that can be really hard to do, either because we only have access to certain people, or maybe there's a certain group of people we want to study, or maybe there's only a certain group of people that we can gain consent from. So that can get a little bit more complicated. So some of the elements you want to consider when you're looking at sample selection is there bias? And what this bias can be is, it can be all sorts of things, but bias in sample selection is very important. Like, did you send out an email to a bunch of different people and say, hey, anyone who responds to this email can be in this study? So you're like, see, my sample is very random. But you don't consider that only people who have access to computers on a regular basis are going to be part of your study. So if you're studying, say, students, and a bunch of students don't participate because they don't have access to computers, that whole entire subset of humans, that whole entire subset of students are not going to be involved in your research. And so now there's just been bias, because it's biased toward those that have perhaps more resources. So that's just one example. That pulls us into the next one, which is inaccurate representation, which falls very closely, ties very closely in with the bias. So we can make broad statements and say, well, students, by our study, we found out that students do such and such. And that might be an inaccurate representation, because it might not be students as a whole. It might be a really small subset of students, or it might only be students in Nebraska, or it might only be students in small towns in Nebraska that are in math programs, and so we have to make sure that we're not causing that to represent people that it isn't. And that leads us to our next point, which is the inability to transfer to a broader audience, which basically means that our subset is too small, our sample is too small, and so now we can't project that information to a bigger group, and that can decrease the usefulness of our information. There can be a lot of difficulty with truly random sampling. Like we said before, it can be very costly, it can be very time-taking, and it can just be hard to make sure that that actually is what is occurring. But it is important to give effort and give time to that, and it's an important thing for us to have on our radar. When we're considering consent in regards to deception, there's some different things that we can consider. When we look at the pros of this, is a lot of times deception gives us more accurate research. If people don't know they're being studied, they're far more likely to give us very valid, just natural, responsive type data. More reactive, like if you're told, I'm going to put this spider on the table and I want you to let me know, this fake spider, I want you to let me know how you feel, is way different than suddenly putting a fake spider on the table and then afterwards asking people, how did you feel when that happened? Because you get more of that natural reactive type response. Another thing is you don't have the participants trying to please the researcher because they don't know what the researcher is trying to accomplish, because they don't fully understand what's going on because of the deception piece. Some of the cons is you can't have true full consent if there's deception. And so that's something you really need to be aware of as a researcher. This can also lead to distrust of research. People can say, well, I thought I was coming in for such and such, and instead it became something else, like you can't trust those people. Another potential con is that there could be unforeseen harm. Like we might evaluate it and think there won't be harm to people in this regards. But there could be somebody that has some sort of past trauma in that regards, or for some reason this element is triggering to them, and it could actually cause them harm. And if they knew what the research was about, they would have let us know that. But since they didn't fully know, they couldn't let us know. Also, you can get responses from people that might be more betrayal based. So people might have strong responses to something, and it's not actually because they're strongly responding to the actual element or to the actual variable, but instead they're responding to the sensation of being betrayed by the researcher. They thought one thing was going to happen, something else happened, and so they might have a stronger emotional response. So those are just some elements to keep in mind as we're considering whether or not deception is truly necessary in our research, and whether or not it's truly ethical, and whether or not we truly have informed consent if we are using deception. The next thing we want to consider is research protocol and instrumentation. So what do we mean when we say research protocol? Research protocol, in short, is basically a blueprint or a recipe for the study. It's the written out, laid out details of here's what the study will be, here's who the participants will be, here's what the thesis is, all the little pieces. Here's what the variables will be, here's what the desired results will be, here's how we'll record the data, here's what the methods of data collection will be, and so on. It outlines the instruments and tools that will be used. It outlines and defines the methods and theories that will be considered. It gives a clear description of the variables, and it provides a structure, or sometimes we would include the documents themselves, of informed consent. This way, if somebody else who's evaluating your research project looks at this, they should be able to have a pretty clear idea of what your project will be, which can be really important, especially if you need to have a review by the board for your project. This can be a very excellent way to begin to present that to them. When we talk about instrumentation, it is basically the nuts and bolts of the data collection, like we were talking about earlier. So instrumentation can be anything that we use to gain the data that we need to complete our study. So instrumentation can be things like questionnaires, interviews, surveys, observations, any elements, any pieces that we're using to gain the data that we need. And these things will be set up and designed based on what we're trying to accomplish in our research. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and close up this PowerPoint. If you guys have any questions, I would love to hear them. So feel free to type those below. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to touch base with you and greatly appreciate you sitting through this. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.